Hello, welcome to Unlearning Our Loneliness, Class 2. Today we're going to be focusing on Pausanias' speech on love and talking about the social aspect of love. Before we jump into that, quick review from last week. We discussed Phaedrus' speech about love, which honored love as the eldest, the noblest, and the mightiest of the gods. The problem with that is that it implied an economic model of love as sacrificial that had only one other person at the center. As I said last week, the speeches tend to build on each other progressively, and so what we'll do with Pausanias is see how he incorporates Phaedrus' structure, alters it, and still falls short of something I would call a healthy vision of love. So this will be a slightly critical lecture. I do not embrace Pausanias as a model lover. As a preview for this week, we'll transition, as I said, to Pausanias, who is the lover of both agathon and making distinctions. As you noted in the reading, he makes a lot of distinctions and distinguishes this from that and this from that. Very fond of that. He wants to justify his own practice as a lover. Pederasty at this time is illegal, but it's tolerated. Okay? But his practice is with a lover who's no longer a boy. Agathon has become a man, and that's slightly unconventional. And so part of his speech on love, just the same way that Phaedrus was trying to justify his choice of lovers, so also is Pausanias making a speech on love that will reflect his own predilections, which is something to keep in mind. His desire to do so leads to a conception of love that is neither intrinsically good nor bad, and he desires to value love over an extended period of time, right? So, whereas Phaedrus was young, and he was all sorts of fond of dying, and the glory of dying at whatever point, right? Pausanias is older. His lover is older. And age, in some ways, gives him insight into the value of time that Phaedrus lacks. And so that'll be something important that we'll talk about shortly. Due to his situation, though, Pausanias also must wrestle with ways that society struggles with the value of love. Again, as an older speaker, he's more concerned, more aware of, and more concerned about some of the social implications of his choices than Phaedrus, who wants to just go out like a burning flame, but nobly, and mightily. So Pausanias builds upon but corrects Phaedrus' speech about love. He's able to agree that love invites nobility, but he distinguishes between a higher and lower levels of love in order to argue that not all loves are noble. Right? So as Phaedrus said, love itself, always noble, anything you do for love, always going to be good. Pausanias wants to say, not everything, right? There's the higher love, there's the lower love. And so he starts out by making that distinction. The higher loves for Pausanias are those which are undertaken for the sake of virtue, while lower loves embrace more fleeting gratifications. So, unlike Phaedrus, who found nobility in sacrifice, Pausanias finds nobility in continuity. And so we'll work through that. As I did last week, I'll start with the conclusion and then kind of work through to see how Pausanias justifies it. So the conclusion is this, and I'll just read that aloud. Thus noble in every case is the acceptance of another for the sake of virtue. This is that love which is the love of the heavenly goddess, and is heavenly and of great price to individuals and cities, making the lover and the beloved alike eager in the work of their own improvement. But all other loves are the offspring of the common or the vulgar goddess. So that's what he ends up concluding. Pausanias starts his speech with this initial distinction. He begins with myth, as does Phaedrus, but he argues that there are two Aphrodites. The heavenly Aphrodite is the daughter of Uranus, and the common one is the daughter of Zeus and Dione. Okay? So he goes back to myth, he has an appeal to his story, and from there he's able to make that initial distinction between the heavenly and the common. He then talks about actions as another way of making distinctions. He claims, quote, actions are not in themselves either good or evil, but turn out in this way or that way according to the mode of performing them. right? So it's the how of a practice, not the why of an intention or the what that happens as a result, right? I mean, he really wants to emphasize the how of a performance as being the ground of moral determinations, okay? This continues Phaedrus's emphasis, or it alters Phaedrus's emphasis on consequences or how things turn out, but Pausanias wants to use consequence as a way to evaluate the action itself, right? So even though there's a notion of a how, that how in some ways still has the intention of wanting to be made more virtuous, right? And it's in some ways always looking ahead to actually accomplishing that fact, right? So his focus is on the how, but he's piling in both the past intention and future consequence to kind of make space for the how of the now, if you will, or the how of the present moment. He uses this ethical claim to make an analogy to love. Quote, "Not every love, but only that which has a noble purpose, is noble and worthy of praise." Okay? And again, that term purpose is slippery, moving toward the side of intentionality or desire rather than the side of consequence. So, I mean, he's setting up kind of a timeline in some ways, but he's very slippery in which side he actually wants to adhere to. It's not a very stable model of time, right? Next, Pausanias doubles down on his approach, the approach of making distinctions, by arguing that a lack of distinctions makes up a common love, right? So heavenly love, by implication, is the kind that's able to make distinctions. The common love doesn't have the insight or the wherewithal to be able to distinguish what's good and bad. Therefore, everything is good from the perspective of the common. And Phaedrus would arguably be sorted into that category by default. So he says, quote, "The common love has no discrimination, being such as the meaner sort of men feel, and is apt to be of women as well as of youths, and is of the body rather than the soul." Right? So if you're pursuing common love, you'll chase women instead of boys, or you'll chase men instead of boys. You know, that's less good. You need to be more discriminating, according to Pausanias. But the other distinction that he makes is still the one that Phaedrus carries. Remember last week we talked about love and earth being created at the same time, according to Phaedrus, right? Here, rather than arguing that point on a cosmic scale, Pausanias wants to just put it in terms of body and soul. So it's the same kind of distinction, it's just less cosmically oriented, right? But he's still favoring soul over body. Those who chase the body are common, those who chase after the soul are heavenly. Does that make sense? It's modifying the Phaedrus' speech, but it's still kind of in that same ballpark. Does that make sense? Okay. So here's why this is important for Pausanias. And this is a longer quote, so bear with me as I read. "Those who are inspired by this heavenly love turn to the male and delight in him who is the more valiant and intelligent nature. For they love not boys, but intelligent beings whose reason is beginning to be developed, much about the time at which their beards begin to grow." Beardedness is always good. It's always a virtue. Remember that. "And in choosing them as their companions, they mean to be faithful to them, and to pass their whole life with them, and be with them, and not take them in their inexperience, and deceive them, and play the fool with them, or run away from one to another of them. But the love of young boys should be forbidden by law, because their future is uncertain. They may turn out good or bad, either in body or soul, and the affection which is devoted to them may be thrown away. In this the good are allowed to themselves, and the coarser sort of lovers ought to be restrained by force." So claims Pausanias, right? So it's interesting. On the one hand, I mean, if you listen to that, I mean, if you highlight some of the key phrases, he's interested in wisdom, or in the soul, which leads to wisdom, which requires a certain amount of maturity, right? And it requires a certain amount of time. And the way that he's describing love, to be faithful, to pass their whole life, to be with them, right? To not take them in their inexperience, but to find a companion or a partner that knows who they are when they make those sorts of choices, right? And on the one hand, that leads to better companionship. But on the other hand, from the perspective of the one who's pursuing or the one who's loving, it stops you from wasting time. Because you never know, and here again is where he slips a little bit into that kind of consequentialist framework, right? You don't know how things will turn out, and you don't want to find a partner who's bad in soul or in body, right? You want to make sure they're good lovers and that they're wise. And the only way to know both is if they're old enough to kind of have a little experience on both sides. Okay? Here too, already, Pausanias is far more interested than Phaedrus in the notion of social force, social norms, and law as a governing structure of regulation. So, on the one hand, heavenly lovers are great, right? They're a law unto themselves. They don't need external force to help them decide right from wrong or to make distinctions. But you got these common lovers who don't know that, right? And those are the ones for whom the laws need to be made. It's a fairly top-down hierarchical approach to how things ought to run. All right. So, so the three things quickly to note. One, sexism and gender politics. As with Phaedrus, men are esteemed over women, which creates a very different climate for homosexuality than what's prominent today. Very, very different. It's not that we're any less sexist, right, in general, but what that means or what the implications of that sexism have shifted in terms of cultural standards of male-male relationships. Two, the fact that Pausanias wants to emphasize the value of a mature love in some ways emphasizes the value of love's certainty, right? To say that you don't want to find, you don't want to waste your time with somebody whose soul or body might be rotten means that you want to make sure that your love is risk-free. It's certain. It's not dangerous. Okay? And again, there's something valuable to that in the sense that Pausanias introduces the notion of time. Right? He wants a companion that will last for a lifetime. He sees the value of a life lived together. And as opposed to Phaedrus, whose value for love is dying, right? Pausanias shifts it from death to life. The value is life, but the meaning of that value is to be risk-free, right? And so in some ways, I think he comes to a point that I agree with more than I agree with Phaedrus' point, but the reasons for that I think are problematic.
I'm still trying to sort out, so is Pausanias' lover apparently younger or older?
He's a little old for a man of Pausanias' age.
And so even though pederasty is illegal, he's defending his choice of lover?
Well, you know, there's what's legal and then there's what's socially encouraged.
Okay.
There's what's tolerated and then there's what's common practice. And I'm not really a scholar of Greek sexuality, so I don't know these distinctions for sure. But I do know that Agathon was an older companion for a man of Pausanias' age, whatever age, I don't know how old he was. And that it was more common to take younger boys, and by the time that they were old enough to start growing beards, tradition says, well, they're too old. You know, you want some good arm candy, not some guy with a beard hanging around you all the time. And Pausanias is trying to shift that a little bit so that his choice of Agathon is deemed more worthy of what really love is from the heavenly sort, rather than the common perspective.
So he is actually arguing that pederasty should probably not be legal.
He says it should not be illegal.
Yeah.
He says it should be illegal.
Yeah. Because that would be the common love. And, you know, boys are used up, thrown away, chased after, lied to, fleeced. And that's not love. Or if it is love, it's just a common love, which nobody wants. Or a lot of people want, but from Pausanias' perspective, it's not good.
And which were the gods that he said created common love?
Well, there are two Aphrodites, right? So one traditionally springs from the head of Uranus, and the other is the daughter of Zeus and Dion.
Okay.
And so the common one has both male and female elements in it, and therefore it's more common because it's mixed, where the one who sprang from the male god's head is unpolluted by any femaleness except for her own femaleness, right? She's totally from a man, so it's okay. That's why she's more heavenly, because there's no womanliness in her except for that which she is. This is just his logic. I'm not going to try to explain it. All right. Any other questions? Okay. So, social implications of what I just read. Number one, societies that condemn the love of youths do so for the wrong reasons. Right? They're the same reasons, according to Phaedrus, and this is in a later passage, that they're the same places that shun philosophy and gymnastics, and it's because they're afraid of love's power. Right? And so Phaedrus understands that love has a certain kind of power to it. I mean, this goes back in some ways to the might that Phaedrus talked about, right? But Pausanias puts it in a little bit broader context. The kind of might that will allow people to die for each other totally pointlessly is the kind of power that overturns countries, right? And so if you're in a tyrannical government, you're going to get rid of philosophy, you're going to get rid of gymnastics, and you're going to get rid of love. So here's the quote where he talks about that. He says, quote, "The interests of rulers require that their subject be poor in spirit, and that there should be no strong bond of friendship or society among them. The ill repute into which these attachments have fallen is to be ascribed to the evil condition of those who make them to be ill reputed, to the rapacity of the governors and the cowardice of the governed." He can throw in some good lines when he wants to. Does that make sense, though? I mean, he understands that love is powerful, and that those who wish to stay in power would do well to make sure love is forbidden. I mean, that's the plot of, what, 1984 and Brave New World. I mean, all the dystopias don't like love. What's the new one? The Hunger Games. People love each other too, right? And that's bad? Haven't read those. I think so. All right. Number two. Society accepts behaviors from lovers that are unacceptable in any other social context. Here's the quote from him. "He may pray and entreat and supplicate and swear and be a servant of servants and lie on a mat at the door. But now there is no friend who will be ashamed of him and admonish him, and no enemy will charge him with meanness or flattery." Right? So, and again, this harkens backwards a little bit to Phaedrus' speech, who we talked about these similar kinds of things. And again, Pausanias is taking what Phaedrus said and putting it into a social context rather than an interpersonal one. So it just kind of expands outward a little bit. Pausanias continues, quote, "The actions of a lover have a grace which ennobles them, and custom has decided that they are highly commendable, that there is no loss of character in them." Unquote. So overall, what Pausanias is doing is introducing the space of love as one at odds with social norms, right? If you play your lover card, you have a free pass. Like, oh, yeah, I was behaving unmanly, but I'm in love. And everybody's like, yeah, okay, that's totally fine. Yeah, right? I mean, you get a pass for that. You can do whatever you want because it's love. And so there's a way that love is forgiven in advance, but what's forgiven of it are those actions which undermine both social norms at a general level and governments at a more political level, right, in different ways. And that's what Pausanias is getting at. Any questions about that? Okay. Now we'll dive into time and continuity. And again, I'll start out with a little longer quote from Pausanias. I like reading Pausanias. He's kind of fun. Here we go. Quote, "Evil is the vulgar lover who loves the body rather than the soul, and who is inconstant because he is a lover of the inconstant." Right? Bodies change, as we all know. And so if you love the body, you love what changes, and you're going to love what changes inconstantly because you don't have any steadiness to go with, right? I'll continue. Quote, whereas the love of the noble mind, which is in union with the unchangeable, is everlasting. Right? And so, again, he's taking on this aspect from Phaedrus, the notion of love and earth, soul and body, and the soul is that which is permanent and doesn't change, whereas fleshly forms are malleable, right? And so you have that kind of split between body-soul, the eternal and the temporal, the transcendent, and like all those kinds of binaries and divisions are very heavily in play, and they're helping Pausanias, again, justify being with an older man. Not older than him, but just older than what's normal. Okay? I'll continue. Quote, "A hasty attachment is held to be dishonorable because time is the true test of this as of most other things. There is a dishonor in being overcome by the love of money, wealth, or of political power, whether a man suffers and is frightened into surrender at the loss of them, or is unable to rise above the advantages of them. For none of these things are of a permanent or lasting nature." Okay? So he lists all the other fleeting things, all the other common loves, all the other things that might move men, and again, his audience is men, to act in ways that would be mighty or noble, potentially, right, or arguably. And he's saying none of those things will matter ultimately because they're all temporary. The only thing that matters is the stability of the permanent and unchanging soul, the noble mind. Okay? And that's his value. That's the ultimate value. But in some ways, what he's able to do with that value then is attach it to the body nonetheless. The value of the unchanging, eternal, ideal soul is connected with the material body of the lover, right? To love the mind requires loving the body through age, through time, right? The mind is still housed. The soul is still enfleshed, right? And the only way to be a constant lover or to consistently love is to love that which changes, or that which is unchanging within that which changes. Maybe that's the better way to state that. Does that make sense? So what doesn't change is soul. What does change is the body, but you can't love the soul without maintaining a relationship with the same body over time as it ages. Does that make more sense? Okay. 3. Loving the soul of another shows what is false and flawed about material and social gains. Right? And so once you love that which is permanent and that which is unchanging, that love, that understanding of the heavenly, shows the flaws in the pursuit of what is common. Right? That's why the heavenly love is able to make distinctions and the common one isn't. You're not able to understand why one is better and one is worse if all you're doing is swimming with the worse. Right? It's only when you're able to have that heavenly love that illuminates the value of soul that chasing after young bodies becomes wrong. But not only that, right? Other kinds of common loves are wrong. The love of power, the love of money, the love of influence. All of those things are also wrong from the perspective of the heavenly. And the only way to gain access to that perspective is to love the soul of another over time, which means being with an older man. See how this all works together? Okay. 4. He indicates that love serves as its own model of evaluation. And again, I'll quote, "He who lives for the sake of virtue, and in the hope that he will be improved by his lover's company, shows himself to be virtuous, even though the object of his affection be proved to be a villain, and to have no virtue. For he has proved that for his part, he will do anything for anybody for the sake of virtue and improvement, and nothing can be nobler than this." And if that sounds a little inconsistent with where he started, I think it is because it's a little inconsistent from where he started, right? On the one hand, he's saying, you can't chase boys because you might waste time, right? And he needs to find an older man. But then what he wants to do is to say that this kind of love is inherently ennobling. You know, if you're a lover and you love the wrong person, that doesn't blow back on you, right? And in fact, in some ways, loving the wrong person shows that you're even more noble, because you'll do it anyway, right? even though you made a mistake, you still have that love. And what you've done in loving a bad object, or having a bad object of devotion, is to show that what you desire more than anything is to behave in a way that's virtuous and to live in a way that strives for improvement. Okay? So in some ways, and again, it's kind of playing that fast and loose with the how. The how is always married to an intention of improvement. To be better, to be more virtuous, right? And if that's the how of your love, if the how you love somebody is for your own improvement, then that ennobles even the choice of a bad object. Make sense? Right, okay. There are a few problems with this. The first problem, I mean, again, ultimately, like Phaedrus, Pausanias is all about the self, right? The value of love comes from improving yourself, and that's why you should love. It's an incredibly self-centered, selfish model of why love is good. It's good because it helps me. And even though it helps me in heavenly ways rather than in common ways, it's still all about what helps me, and not about what love itself is or how it helps the beloved, perhaps, right? And so again, I think the way that he's trying to help himself is perhaps more noble than what Phaedrus was looking for, right? Phaedrus wants his name to be in a list of other names of heroic people who died nobly and mightily for love. Pausanias wants a love that will allow him to live a better life rather than dying a better death. Right? And personally, I'm biased toward the living of the better life rather than the dying of a better death. I mean, I want to die a better death someday, but I don't need to rush it, really, senselessly. So I think that it's, again, I think it's an improvement over Phaedrus, but it's still really, really limited as a way to view love or as a model for love. And when you look at relationships in society today, I think that that notion of improvement, like wanting to be with somebody that makes you a better person, is a model that you hear, right? Or not wanting to be with somebody that makes you a worse person. You know, that person's a bad influence with you, don't be with that person. This person's a good influence with you, you should be with that person, right? And I think that those kinds of narratives are fairly common. They're fairly prevalent, right? And maybe not in terms of stories that you'll see in a movie or on a TV show or a sitcom or whatnot. I'm not sure, but in ways that people talk about the relationships that they're in, or the judgments that people make about those relationships, you'll hear this kind of thing, right? And when you hear that kind of judgment being made, it's not that it's wrong to improve, right? It's not that it's wrong to not want to degrade, but that shouldn't necessarily be the sole determining virtue of whether or not a love is good, right? For a love to be good, it should be about more than whether you're better. Or at least I want a love that looks like that. And because this is one of the early speeches, I will hint. I won't give away the ending. There's no one of those warnings. What are the warnings?
Trigger warnings?
Not a trigger warning, but like a
Spoiler
alert. That's the yeah. This is not a spoiler alert. This is not the end of the story for Plato, right? And so it's a weaker vision of love. It's not bad. It's better, but it's still limited. Okay. 2, Pausanias' speech is incredibly hierarchical and ideal, right? I mean, the fact that he wants to use social force to forbid things, the fact that he's making a distinction between the heavenly and the common, the heavenly people are a law unto themselves, the commoners need to have force applied to prevent them from acting as they want to do, even though they don't understand those kinds of distinctions, it's incredibly patriarchal. I mean, it's a flawed system in the way that he tries to engineer it. There's no sense of equality or mutuality or even physicality, right? And for all the ways that he's trying to laud staying with the same person over time, the fact that he wants to do it based on the soul, I mean, there are maybe intimations that there's still sex happening, but it's not about a physical communion. It's just about the fact that this noble soul is stuck in this body that's getting older and older and older and embearded over time, right? And you know, it's kind of unfortunate, but if you want to save the soul, which is the right thing to do, you're going to have to put up with the body. But it's not a physical love. It kind of is, right? You can see that kind of backdoor. He was trying to justify having sex with Agathon, but that's not how he wants to defend it. He's not able to just come out and say this also has value, right? He's defending it through this idealistic way, which I think problematically inframes the whole of the speech. Does that make sense? Okay. He talks about, here's another quote, a communion based on the one capable of communicating wisdom and virtue, the other seeking after knowledge and making his object education and wisdom. Right? And so, I mean, here again you have the older man whose job is to educate, and the younger whose job it is to learn. Right? And so there's a communion there, but it's definitely not a communion of equals. Right? It's definitely not a balanced partnership. It's definitely informed by power and the need for power. And if you allow that to kind of retrospectively reflect on the rest of the text, a lot more of this looks at power too, right? You know, the power of being with something, the certainty of having something permanent and unchanging, right? There's a certain sense of power that gives, a sense of control, a sense of certainty, and all those things start to merge together as you look at why Pausanias is framing love in this particular sort of way. Okay. Number two, the value of love, here's the second problem, still remains anchored in external values of self-improvement beyond the relationship between two. Right? The two people fall away, it's really just about one. And that's a problem, at least for me. So that's Pausanias' speech. Are there any questions?
So since the like dynamic of love is also a dynamic of education in this case, then you're trying to train the object to eventually become the person objectifying.
Well, but I mean, maybe they'll become the older man for a younger man after you die. Right. But you're going to be lifelong companions, right? And so you're not training them to be anything but somebody who will be trained by you.
That's not even sustainable.
Well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of relationships in the world today that sustain themselves over decades with one person having power over the other and training that person to be trained over time. It is sustainable. That's the problem with it. And it's justified. And people think that it's love. And that's the way in which loving over time becomes a little poisonous. Also, when you're trapped into a power hierarchy situation where there's a disparity of power, but you really want to value that power over time, if you're the older man, awesome, good for you. If you're the younger person, yeah, you can't break away, right? And if you believe in the virtue of love over time, no matter what, there's no hope for you. You'll always be the younger man. And you'll never have parity.
So what about in the case of pederasty then? Maybe in that case it works out because you eventually grow up and get to try on the other role?
Maybe, but I think that the problems that Pausanias hints at is that you're going to be used up and discarded. Right? What you'll learn about love is that you're an object for somebody else's sexual pleasure, and that's it. You know, there's not a lot of education that comes because the only thing the common people want are the body. They're not interested in education at all. So those who chase boys don't care about the educational aspects of it, and so that doesn't work out either. Ben? Jim? Question? Taylor? All right. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I'll see you all next week.